Hi everyone that's just joined us. I assume some more people will be coming in over the next couple of minutes. So we'll just leave a little time for a few people to continue to come in before we get started proper. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is James Petty. I am a project officer at the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association, VADA. And I'm one of my projects is the ADRIA research grants program, the Alcohol and Drug Research Innovation Agenda. And so this webinar is part of, is open to anyone, but is also part of that, part of the support we're providing to applicants for those grants through ADRIA. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. Obviously, those are some varied lands at the moment. So I'm in Brunswick, the lands of the Wurundjeri Willem people. And I'm very close to the Mary, which is believed to be the site of the Batman Treaty between colonists and traditional owners, which was subsequently overturned by the Governor of New South Wales, Richard Burke. And I think that's interesting. That was in 1835, so I think that's interesting to reflect on, given the challenges around treaty, constitutional recognition and other issues that we're still facing. Anyway, as we're meeting on varied lands, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of all the lands that we're meeting on, their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. You may have noticed that we're not in the usual webinar format. We're actually in Zoom's standard format, the meeting mode. Our presenter, Alison Ritter, will say more about that in a moment. But just a bit of housekeeping, we've automatically muted everyone, so you should be on mute. So if you do want to speak at any point, you will need to unmute yourself, but try to remember to re-mute yourself once you're done, otherwise we get a lot of background noise. Also, if your computer's struggling with bandwidth, I don't know what that means, but it's a word that people say, you can try turning off your camera or switching the view to speaker only mode, so you're not kind of overloading your internet capacity. If you have any questions, you can either ask them in person towards the end or write them into the chat function, which will be monitored. I can answer a couple of standard questions that always come through. And that is that the webinar will be recorded and made available on the ADRIA website, and a copy of the slides will also be sent to attendees as well. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sam Biondo, our VADA's Executive Officer. Sam.
Thanks, James. I thought you were going to say esteemed leader there for a minute, but I'll take what comes. Look, it's a really great pleasure to be introducing Professor Alison Ritter. She's really very well known to us, a great friend of the alcohol and drug sector across Australia. She was a member of the board at VADA for a period of time and worked locally at Turning Point. So she's got a good understanding of Melbourne, a fantastic understanding of alcohol and drug issues across the country. You know, if I keep it formal, Alison is an internationally recognised drug policy scholar. She's director of the Drug Policy Modelling Program at the University of New South Wales. She's an NHMRC Senior Research Fellow. Her research work spans many topics across our space. She was also a clinical psychologist, so she's had her feet planted very much on the ground in our sector for many years. It's a great pleasure to have her speak today, and she's going to overview some of the common ethical issues encountered in AOD focused research. Welcome, Alison. Great to see you.
Thanks very much, Sam, and thank you, James. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, which is different for everybody. I'm on Bedegal people of the Eora Nation. This land's been stolen, it's never been ceded. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I've chosen to use the normal Zoom mode because this is actually a workshop, just in case you thought you were going to be doing your emails and so on, which you can do if you wish. But I'm actually going to be toggling between my slides, some exercises that we're going to be doing, and lots of discussion and interaction. To that end, can I ask people to turn on their cameras for a moment so we can actually say hi to everybody who's here, for those that can. Hi, welcome everybody. It's really nice to see people's faces, particularly through this period. The chat function is there for interaction and for us to talk. There'll be some exercises that we'll be doing with that, but at any time type anything into the chat room aside from, you know, a flat white, no sugar, because I'm not going to be able to supply coffee. And the plan is to have a lot of time at the end to cover points of interest, questions, issues, because I'm not going to be able to raise every possible ethical related issue. So I'm going to kick off with some slides. Feel free to turn your cameras off again for the moment, or leave them on, whatever your particular preference is. So now I just need to make sure the slides are working. So welcome, which has already been done. I did just want to check about recording the session. So because this is, I'm trying to run this as a workshop, this is an experiment. If there's anything that gets said today that people are uncomfortable with, please flag it. You can put your hand up, you can put something in the chat room. I'm not anticipating that there will be, but as I will explain, ethics is all about value judgments, and it's difficult and complicated on occasions. So just let me know if there's a particular thing that you've said that you wish to be removed from the recording. And as James has said, the slides will be available. I've kind of structured this around practical aspects for ethics applications, but I'm not going to cover everything. And as I think I've already alluded to, ethics is constantly evolving work. The committees change, the issues change. One year they're really hot on criminal activity. The next year they don't care about that. All they care about is paying participants. So it changes over time, and it changes by committee, and it involves value judgments. There's not right and wrong here. There never is. So this is about the norms of practice and value judgments, which evolve over time. So ethics is great. It's really, obviously it's really important. It protects the participants of research, and it protects you as the researchers. It makes sure you have thought about what you're going to do before you do it. That's its biggest strength. If you haven't thought through how you're going to do the study in order to write the ethics application, you're going to head into trouble. And lots of projects run into all sorts of trouble, but the ones that have had a good ethics application and the team has really thought through the issues are much less likely to go wrong. And of course, the purpose of ethics is to ensure that it's high quality research, that it's ethical, that it's appropriate, and that it's monitored. Ethics committees have reports every 6 months, every 12 months. So it's actually great, and it's absolutely a fundamental part of doing research. It's also a huge pain in the ass. There is a huge amount of paperwork, like a huge amount of paperwork. I've just recently done 3 different ethics applications, and they run to hundreds of pages in some cases. There are lots of different committees. I'm involved in a project that's had to apply to more than 20 ethics committees because different organisations are covered by different committees. It takes time. We usually, depending on the project, allocate 2 to 6 months to get ethics approval. And in theory, we try and do it before we've got the funding. So as soon as we've got the funding, we can hit go. But then if you don't get the funding and you've spent all of this time writing an ethics application, nutting out a study to write an ethics application, it's anyway, a problem. And ethics committees, they are fickle and pedantic, but that happens to be their job. So the first lesson is make the ethics process work for you. If you enter this with thinking this is just a huge pain and it's just a stupid thing and I shouldn't have to do it, that is not going to be a helpful attitude, obviously. It is good. I mean, it is great, and it means you have to think about your study and think about what you're doing before you start doing it. And it will save you time in the end. It won't feel like it when you're filling in all of the forms, but it will save you time in the conduct of the research. So make it work for you. Ethics applications cover, generally speaking, these sorts of things: the research aims, the study design, including the design itself, stakeholders, sample size, data collection, the participants, recruitment, consent, reimbursement, risks, data analysis, data storage, and dissemination. I'm not going to cover all of these, and I'm not necessarily going to cover them in this order. Oh, so lesson 2 is that ethics committee applications vary by committee. Make sure you use the right forms. I have made that mistake where I have taken an old ethics application and used it as the platform because a lot of the issues are very similar, and it's been the wrong form and it's been rejected. It's sent back to me. So there are some simple things like that about using the right forms that really help, and know your ethics committee. That's a whole other topic of, for a seminar. What I'm going to do is cover 7 areas. They're the red highlighted areas today. Some of these are generic to any kind of research, but most of them have specific issues for alcohol and other drugs, and that is what we want to concentrate on today. Lesson number 3 is that alcohol and drug research has some special issues that don't occur with other topic areas, and that's really what we want to focus on today. So whilst some of these are generic, there will be more. They will apply, some of them apply more generally. And the first one we're going to talk about is stakeholder and community consultation in the design. So what I want to hear from you in the chat is, what does stakeholder or community consultation actually mean in practice? Some words, some thoughts about what it actually means in practice. And I can start people off. Talking to people. Oh, you're going to have to excuse my bad typing. Yep, collaboration. Thanks, Barbara. Really listening. Yes, absolutely. Consulting with the community, running focus groups, having face-to-face contact with the community of interest. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Aston. Meaningful and informed. Absolutely. Yes, Sione, it's often tokenistic, and we will talk about that in a minute. Thank you very much. All involved will play a part. That's exactly right. Thanks, Nicole. Other thoughts? Yeah. The use of language, and that the language is appropriate to the group that you're working with. Thanks, Christine. And Nigel, the research has to be of value to the community. Absolutely. We're not doing research for research's sake. Transparency and good communication. Yeah. Yeah. Being authentic. Yeah. So there's a really strong theme here. I think you all understand that it's not about tokenism. This is being about authentic, appropriate, meaningful. Yeah, thanks, Sam. Puts the person's interest up front in a protective way. And the research understands the issues for the community and the feedback to the community. Yeah. It has got noticeably more engaging over time. That's a really good sign. And and should also include the community all the way along, including at the analysis phase. Absolutely. I think all the points that I'm going to make in my slides are all coming up. Making sure people get provided with the results. Yes. Yeah. That's great. So they're all exactly the right kind of sentiments. The question is, do you do them? And did you do them for this ADRIA? Is that how you say it? ADRIA research grant round. You don't need to answer. That's not a yes/no question. We'll come to yes/no questions later. So, nothing about us without us. If you remember that and you really do that, you are engaging your community in alcohol and other drug research. And as many people have already commented in the chat room, it starts at the very beginning. It doesn't start after you've written the proposal, or you've received the grant, or you're writing the ethics application. It starts before you've even decided what the question is. It starts with working with the community to decide what's the most important question. And that gives the research an ethical basis, because the question or the idea or the area that you're investigating has come from community. It's seen as important and needed, and it's emerging from community. Ethics committees are one of the things that they need to think about is this project necessary? Because if it's not necessary, it's not ethical, because you're wasting people's time. If your project has been grounded in community, whatever you take that to mean, it will be ethical and it will show in your ethics application. Not every ethics committee asks for stakeholder engagement. The ones that I work with largely do. Certainly my university ethics committee expects that. I think it's becoming more and more common, and perhaps Sioni's comment in the chat about how it's getting a bit better might be a reflection of ethics committees taking this responsibility more seriously. Even if an ethics committee doesn't have a specific question, put it in, because it's an ethical grounding for your research work. And right at the end, I'm talking about dissemination, but someone else has also made the comment that it needs to go right the way through. So it's generating the idea, it's writing the proposal, it's writing the ethics application, it's conducting the research, it's then analysing the data together, it's then writing together and co-authoring reports together, and then it's giving research results back to community. And that's the very last thing. We'll finish with the dissemination of research, ethical approaches to dissemination of research. Okay, number 2. So lesson 4 is engage the community and the stakeholders early and often. Recruiting participants. This is quite tricky. So we've got 7 questions. Now you need a piece of pen and paper. Don't put your answers in the chat room, because you just need to jot down on a bit of paper. So each of these questions has a yes, no, or a maybe. Okay? So write the numbers 1 to 7. Here we go. Is it okay for the treating clinician to recruit to a study being done by another researcher? Just write down yes, no, or maybe. Number 2, is it okay for the treating clinician to recruit to a study that they are doing? James has just sighed. Number 3, is it okay for VADA to send out a recruitment flyer to its member organisations for them to circulate to clients? Yes, no, maybe. Number 4, is it okay for a researcher to sit in a waiting room and ask people, punters, as they walk through whether they'd like to participate? Number 5, is it okay to make research data collection part of usual clinical assessment without asking for individual consent? Ooh, yes, no, no, maybe. Number 6, is it okay to put up a poster in a clinic with contact details for research? And number 7, is it okay for a researcher to email or send a text message to clients to invite them to participate? Okay. Now I'm hoping everyone's had enough. These are not easy questions, and there's not a definitively right answer, but there are better answers. We're going to go through them. Does anyone need a bit more time, or you're all okay having answered your 7 questions? Okay. These are the answers that I would give to these questions, and we can open it up and take people off mute, and happy to have a conversation after I've been through the slide to talk about some of these. Is it okay for the treating clinician to recruit to a study being done by another researcher? Generally, yes. The clinician will have some information about a study that someone else is doing. They can explain that to the client and maybe conduct a screening and then pass them on to the researcher for consent. However, the second answer is probably no. Is it okay for a treating clinician to recruit to a study that they are doing? Most ethics committees would not accept that that's ethical due to the potential for coercion and the fact that there is a set of power relationships between the client and the clinician. So when I was working as a clinical psychologist and doing research, I couldn't recruit directly from clients that I was assessing or, you know, working with because of perceived coercion. Usually what happens is you get another team member to approach the client who's not involved in the client's care. Is it okay for VADA to send out recruitment flyers to its members for them to circulate? Yes, with permission from VADA. That's one of VADA's big strengths, I think, and it's called arm's length recruitment because the researcher is not directly, if there's a researcher clinician, is not directly engaging with the client. VADA's offering that to services, and then services distribute the information, and then the client or prospective research participant contacts the research team. So the bit that's important is that the person being recruited feels the capacity to make an independent decision, not out of any power relationship or coercion. Is it okay for a researcher to sit in a waiting room and ask people as they walk through? Yes, with permission of the clinical service. Yes, indeed, because there's no power relationship between the researcher and the prospective client. There's lots of things about intoxication and safety and so on, but you know, in principle, yes. Is it okay to make research data collection part of usual clinical assessment without asking for individual consent? The answer to that is no. You can use people's clinical data anonymised and de-identified that's been collected for clinical purposes, but if you are collecting data for research purposes, like you slip an extra K10 into every assessment or a whatever, Beck depression inventory, no, that's not okay. Because that wouldn't have been what the client would have experienced in the absence of that research data collection as part of routine care. Is it okay to put up a poster in a clinic? Yes, if you're a really old-fashioned researcher like me, and you can even put one with little tags on it and people can tear off the phone number and ring up and express interest in the study. Is it okay for a researcher to email, send a message to clients to invite them to participate? This is line ball. The answer is probably no. It's not quite arm's length enough. It's the difference between sitting in a waiting room and saying, "G'day, you know, I'm I'm doing a survey, are you interested? And the person saying no, you know, bugger off, or oh yeah, I'll, you know, whatever. That's different from sending a direct message or a direct email, and is regarded as a bit more likely to be perceived to be coercive. But the biggest problem with that option is, how did the researcher get an email address? So the researcher can't get a list of the email addresses of clients. That would be a significant breach of privacy. So when you're a clinician researcher, you need to think about the fact that you have access to information about a pool of clients, prospective research participants, that you wouldn't have if you were independent from that organisation. So one of the principles as a clinical researcher is to think, if I was outside this organisation, what would I be allowed to access? And if you wouldn't have been allowed to access it, then you, under other circumstances, then you shouldn't access it as for research. So no coercion, no dual relationships, and arm's length recruitment. Now, we don't need to know how people went, what their scores are, but are there comments or issues or things that this raises that people wanted to comment on, or people disagreeing with the answers, which, as I said at the beginning, ethics is about value judgments, which is also fine. And if you want to speak, just unmute yourself. I'm happy to be quite free-flowing. We haven't got that many people. We've only got 25 participants, so you can all get a chance to talk. Or put your hand up.
Alison, we do have a question in from Nicole in the chat box asking if question 7 would be okay if part of an ongoing research and participation.
If they've already consented, absolutely. Yes, that's a really good point, Nicole. Thank you. So if someone's already in a study and they've said, yes, I'm in this and here's my email address, and gives the email address to the researcher, completely, yes. And
thanks, Alison.
Yeah, no worries, Nicole. And Christine, did you want to ask your question?
I just wondered in that last one whether the organisation delivering the service had actually asked the person or their clients, could they pass on their details to a researcher who would make contact? Would that be okay? And they'd given consent?
Yeah, it's a good question, Christine. I don't know. I'd be surprised if under the privacy provisions organisations were allowed. Or maybe they are allowed to do it. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. It's just a, I thought that might have been a way that you could do it.
Yeah. Yeah, potentially.
And that way the person could still say no to the researcher once they found out what it was about.
Sure.
Because the clinician wouldn't be telling them about necessarily what the research was.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that one of the principles of this idea about sort of arm's length or having a gap. Yeah, thanks, Kim. I saw you come off mute. I will come to you in a minute. Is clinicians could send clients an email or a message that says there's a study going on about, I don't know, injectables or whatever it's about. If you want to participate, this is the researcher's phone number. Because the ethical principle here is that the client is instigating, or the prospective participant is making the choice to instigate, as opposed to potentially being or perceived to be coerced. So that's another way of doing it. So a service could send out a broadcast email to its clients saying, you know, there's a study going on about, I don't know, cocaine injecting or whatever it is. If you're interested, here's the researcher's contact details. That would be considered quite ethical because there's no coercion and it's arm's length. Kim, question 5.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. So my question is around the process of student placement. So we've been collecting data around stigma. Well, it's a modified medical condition regard scale. So we've been collecting that pre and post student placement, but not as part of a research, but with the understanding that we'd like to look at it later. And now there's a student who wants to take that on as a thesis. And we've had some discussion around the use of the retrospective data. Because in this case, I have been very careful not to bias or bring stigma conversations up at the beginning of their placement. So I think one of the arguments could be that by raising the nature of the study, it could bias their answers in the pre and post.
So can I just check in, is this stigma with the student or stigma experienced by students or by clients?
It's a stigma towards working with people who use alcohol and other drugs.
Okay, so it was the students that were surveyed?
Yes.
Ah,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
See, that changes it a bit for me. Isn't that interesting? Because I don't think students are a vulnerable population in the same way as people who use alcohol and other drugs.
Yes.
I'm probably biased.
Yeah.
But if it was asking clients, I think you'd absolutely have to get ethics, because I regard them as a vulnerable population,
Yes.
potentially a vulnerable population.
So I think what we're leaning towards viewing it as is observational. Well, it's not observational, but yeah. Sorry. Continue. Sorry, Alison.
No. Yeah, no. It's a really good point, Kim. And I mean, I don't think we can solve it right now. But what it does raise is the problem of foresight and of knowing when you're doing something that it might prove valuable to use it in a research capacity down the track.
Yes.
So I've done interviews with people where it hasn't been for research purposes and then realised that there was something really, really important and rich there. And if I'd thought ahead, you know, I would have done it. So yeah.
And I'm thinking, I guess we've been thinking it from the terms of there's no harm to students.
Yeah.
There's no potential harm being done by the students doing the surveys, but there is a reason for not explaining the purpose of the surveys.
Sure. I mean, it's ethically okay to not disclose the purpose of research.
Yeah.
But it's not ethically okay not to get consent.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, more thinking time there, Kim. And you know, one of the we'll come to you in a tick, Nigel. But one of the tricky things is I don't want to ring an ethics committee and ask whether something's okay, because unless I'm prepared for them to say no, it's not, and then that's the end of the matter. But
yes.
You know, developing good relationships with ethical office advisors who are in ethics officer type positions is often helpful, so you can have the sort of off the record conversation about how this might be treated or dealt with.
Yeah, and I guess, well, the student would be doing it through their university, so I don't know if there's any difference in the university ethics committees or ethics processes. So
yeah, there are big differences between universities.
Okay.
Weirdly.
Yeah.
So it'd be good to get some advice from the university, actually. And you know, James can help as the research person for VADA.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you for sharing the experience. That's a good one. Nigel, question 1.
Thanks, Alison. Sometimes what we have with our clients is when the treating clinician suggests another referral to another service, or you know, taking up another, you know, doing something, clients follow what the clinician talks about because they want to please the clinician. I'm wondering about question 1, when the treating clinician asks a client about a research study, if that would, if the client feels like, you know, that would make my clinician happy, if I do this research, it's straight away, it's not necessarily intended coercion, but it can be perceived or interpret it that way. I'm just wondering, how does that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Nigel. And I think it depends a lot on how the treating clinician approaches it with the client. And you know, often there's a script about this, which might say, you know, happens at the very end of a session. You know, I just wanted to mention that there is a research study going on. This is what it involves. I'm not involved in the study. There's no obligation to participate. Would you, is this something you're interested in talking about some more? So some, you know, no skin off my nose if you do or don't. You know, just making sure that that there is no sense. But I agree with you. Clients want to please their clinicians, and if they think that, you know, accepting being in a study, there will then be a formal consent process, I must say. So then there's also the opportunity for the client to say, yeah, I'm interested, but then not consent in the end with the researcher.
I like that comment you made, the suggestion you made earlier for the client to initiate the contact with the researcher. So even in that, if the client initiates it,
That's
and
right.
information is provided, it allows one step for thinking and processing.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Stefan, welcome. You want to talk about whether program evaluation is different from research? And what about client satisfaction surveys?
Yeah, look, thanks, Alison, and sorry I missed the start. I'm just aware in many programs in many sectors, people might get a text message or an email or a contact from someone saying, look, I'm evaluating this service, I'm interested in your experience of it, or you know, rate this service, satisfaction with, etc., etc. And whether that is seen any differently by ethics committees, because often they have given quite different experiences or responses to us if it's for program evaluation of your own service rather than some independent research that's for another purpose.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have a view. What a surprise. For me, program evaluation is research, and people should be consented to participate in an evaluation of the service, and that should go through an ethics committee. I know some people argue that program evaluation is quality assurance and therefore it doesn't need to be reviewed by an ethics committee and therefore there doesn't need to be consent. My own view is you want to consent clients, and I think at the beginning of someone joining Odyssey or any other treatment program, you want to say, do you agree to being contacted after the treatment is finished? And client satisfaction surveys are also for, you know, are you prepared to fill this in? I mean, that's a form of consent for client satisfaction surveys. So I'm largely of the view that people should always be consenting, whether it's with the oversight of a formal ethics committee.
I think I agree on those. The question is just how would that contact be made? Now, obviously, if you do it as the clinicians of the service and you're doing that as a two-step process, you know, you're happy to be contacted by an independent person to evaluate our service. That's one step. Or, you know, I guess in relation to this question, when the service has got those contact details, could someone else from that service, there's a bit of arm's length from the clinicians, who might still be considered a researcher within that program, make that contact, still seeking consent, absolutely, still abiding by ethical principles.
Yeah, and I think the point that Nigel was making earlier about the arm's length thing, I mean, the other way to do it is for the person in the service to send out the message and say, please contact so-and-so. So it's not just, I mean, you're going to lose people. It's dropout rates is the big problem, of course, but so it's not just getting the person, in a sense, catching them on the phone, but making sure there's a process by which the person has to act actively in order to participate.
And
And
I
the other
think
thing,
that's the key challenge,
yeah,
the dropout rate, and at what point, you know,
yeah,
is that so low that any value that comes from it,
yeah,
you know, then becomes not ethical to actually describe. So.
yeah, yep, yep, exactly, exactly. And Nigel's asked about VADC. James, can I toss that one to you?
Yeah, sure. I probably can't answer that categorically, but I think with the VADC, you're probably, and look, it's not perfect, but I think you're probably making the assumption that, I mean, A, the data should be, you know, anonymized. You're probably making the assumption that the agency, both the VADC and the organisations that are submitting data to it, that they are doing so ethically. So I think it is a really tricky question, but I think, say, for someone who's wanting to engage VADC or, you know, look at some of the data it produces, you know, I think you need to work on an assumption that it's been done ethically, which is you know, it's an imperfect answer, but yeah, you know, I think it's similar with all sorts of data collection bodies, is that, you know, you say if you're a researcher wanting to engage with them, you can't take responsibility with those huge data sets or those larger ones. You know, you can't necessarily take responsibility for the things that were beyond your control around that, and you need to make some assumptions about that. That's the best answer I have.
Yeah, thanks, James. And look, let's pick up secondary data analysis of things like, you know, hospital records or VADC, because there are, I mean, you do need ethics for that, but you're not directly recruiting participants, and consent is implied, is the term, in the original collection of those data, and they're all anonymised and de-identified, which is an additional protection. Okay, right, we might run out of time. Here I was thinking I had lots of time. So the third area I wanted to talk about was consent. Actually, I don't think I need to talk about this very much at all, because I'm super confident that people who work in alcohol and drugs know how to get consent and how not to get consent when someone is intoxicated or in other ways impaired. We know that consent to participate involves understanding what's involved, being informed about the study and about the risks, and still being willing to proceed. You've got to be completely frank about the risks. We'll come to that. But the thing that ethics committees worry about is the actual consenting process. And, you know, they're just as bloody stupid about alcohol and drugs as the general community. So they think that people, I don't know, don't have free will or can't consent if they're under the influence and so on. And some people can't consent if they're under the influence, some people can. I'm really confident that you could document clear consent procedures for someone who might have consumed substances in the preceding couple of hours. Is that a reasonable assumption, given we're working with experienced people here? Yes, James is nodding. No one else has got. Yes, thank you, Kim. Thank you. Yep, Nicole's saying yes. Good. You just need to write about that in the ethics committee, and it's a good way to educate ethics committees, which is also part of our job, to educate ethics committees. So lesson 6 is work out the procedures of how you're going to do it, document them, write them up for your ethics application, and help educate ethics committees better about these issues. So reimbursement. So this is a case study. A person reportedly completed a research interview, was paid $20 in cash, and then purchased and injected heroin and died. The police attended the scene and found the research card on the deceased. There was a coronial investigation around the death. And the coronial investigation asked the question, did the research payment lead to the person's death, and were the researchers culpable? So this happened in 2002, it happened to me, and it was at Turning Point. And it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. It was terrible that the person died. We knew that there were people coming in to do a survey and getting $20 cash and trying to come in the next day and do it again, and the next day and do it again. And in fact, the story was that this person was with two friends and that they pooled the $20 each that they got for $60 and purchased $60 worth of heroin and died within a few hours of leaving the research centre. The investigating coroner, we gave evidence. The investigating coroner concluded that the payment of $20 to participants for time and out-of-pocket expenses, so you're paying them for time and out-of-pocket expenses, you're in a sense valuing their experience, should be reviewed. Now, some people might know this case and know what my position is. I don't know how long I mean, it is a long time ago now, I guess, 2002. Yeah, okay, so Nicole is saying we've had this experience at CoHealth, no police, but the organisation decided no cash. Yeah, okay.
Obviously, I'll just say, Alison, to that we obviously can't have control over external researchers paying cash to our clients.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was something that for a very long time, and this was when it was the old Western Region Health Centre. If our organisation was doing research, then yes, we were not to provide cash. Yeah.
Thanks, Nicole. I see that Natasha says it's possible they would have found another way to purchase substances. Absolutely.
Can I just jump in, Alison? It's Peter.
Sure, Peter.
Yeah, this drives me nuts, this question, because really, and it's sort of not the problem. The problem is the setting in which people live and the regulations under which drugs are sold and banned and stuff like that. I think it goes down to paternalism and stigmatisation, and it reinforces that whole thing about, you know, you can't be trusted with money.
Yep.
And I just wonder what message we send people when we are, you know, because if I do stuff like that, I get paid, you know, for my time. So in my years at YSAS, this was the cyclical argument about, do we pay young people for their information, for their expertise, or do we buy them, what was it, vouchers or movie tickets, which they bloody well sold anyway and used for drugs anyway. I mean, you know, really? So, you know.
Okay, so you're getting a lot of support there, Peter. Ginny, Nicole, Catherine, Sione.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree with Peter, because you know, we need to respect the individual and the individual's right.
Yeah.
And we could give them a small job and give them $20 if they earn that by cleaning or doing some task for the organization. Would that be treated in the same way?
Yeah.
They're free to earn a living.
Yeah. And yet it is not uncommon for there to be policies to use vouchers, as Nicole has said, because of the potential risks. So let me tell you what my position is. Thank Christ it's the same. So there was a lot of work that was done at the time, and Craig Fry, who some of you may know, led a lot of this work. We did research, we did a whole lot of advocacy, and reviewed our policies. First up, payment is fair and reasonable. So it goes without saying that we should pay participants for their time and for sharing their experiences. So studies that don't pay participants can be regarded as unethical. That has budget implications, of course. And some studies with large numbers of people choose to do draws for iPads or, you know, some kind of, you know, go into a draw to win something or whatever. So paying people is fair and reasonable. You need to obviously make sure that the payment is not large enough that it is an incentive. So, you know, $500 for a 30-minute interview would clearly be regarded as an incentive. And in the alcohol and drug field, there's a sort of a standard rate usually that people are paid, and that's usually set by the IDRS and the ADRS when they're in the field, those sentinel surveys. Now, the issue of via cash versus voucher. So at the time and subsequent to this coronial inquiry, I argued strongly for cash, that this was discriminatory. It was making assumptions about people's capacity to make choices, that we wouldn't pay a businesswoman in a voucher because we worried that she would buy shoes, which might not be in her best interests. Why would we think anything differently from people who use drugs? And I actually think that the cashless debit card has really heightened awareness of the discriminatory aspects to paying people with cards or valuing people with cards. And I think that's given us some better leverage, at least better understanding about this issue. I must say, I haven't been pinged on it by an ethics committee for some time. So this is an example of an issue that got really hot and then it died down. It reared its head again occasionally. Occasionally it does, but it hasn't. And now, of course, with COVID, I mean, cash is a problem with COVID. So I think we're probably going to end up with vouchers or FTE transfers, but so we do some bank transfers, but the problem is most people don't have a bank account, or they've lost their card, or, you know, it's complicated. So the environment around which this issue about cash payment occurs has probably shifted unexpectedly around COVID. You'll get a copy of these slides. These are two papers. The paper that we wrote about the coronial case, a paper from Craig with review and guidance. And this italicized text is the one I put in pretty much all of my ethics applications, and I usually add a couple of references just to make it sound important. Reimbursing participants in AOD research has been a standard research practice since the 1980s, is considered ethical, recognising people's time and experience. The amount of reimbursement is not an inducement, and I usually specify the amount. Research participants who use and who may be dependent on drugs deserve the same ethical protections and choices during research as other participant groups. So I copy and paste that into pretty much every ethics application. It's partly just educating ethics committees, and I haven't been pinged on it for, I don't know, 10 years probably now. So I think the environment's changed a little bit. And I see some people are commenting, yeah, I mean, people agree it should be cash, but it's hard now. Put money directly into people's bank accounts. No, there aren't privacy issues if you get consent. So, and how you treat that information after you've made the payment. So we destroy it, and we have an elaborate, you know, destruction protocol for the details of people's bank accounts after the event. I mean, we'll come to data storage because that's a whole other, jeepers, I need to move a bit faster. That's a whole other issue. Okay, you'll get these slides. You can click on those links, and they'll take you to the papers. And I think we're all in accord, and the lesson is reimbursement can be tricky. Use the resources here to craft the right kind of arguments to ethics. One, cash, if not direct payment into bank accounts, if not vouchers, and who knows where we're going to land with our cash economy in COVID times. Okay. Risks and data privacy and confidentiality. Okay, another opportunity to brainstorm into the chat about the potential risks for participants. It doesn't matter what kind of study, there are sort of generic risks. What are the kind of risks that might be associated with being in a research study run by alcohol and drug people? Pop them into the chat. Distress. Oh, I'm on the wrong screen. Identification. Thanks, James. Distress. Exposure to triggers. Is that stress? Feeling like they can't give the correct answer. Yeah. Hey, good one, Nicole. Triggers. Yeah. Oh, you can see now. See, oh, home address. Thank you, Mick. Mike. Yes, their personal story being used in a recognisable format. The risk, saying what we think people want to hear. Yeah, it is an AOD dynamic. Yeah, the right answer problem. How information is destroyed after the research is finished. Yeah. Any others that people have got? Any other potential risks? Feeling used. Thanks, James. Yeah, who'll read it? Will I be recognised? Yeah, thanks, Philip. Yes, the risk of subpoena. We're going to be covering that, Catherine. And child protection issues. So, yeah, sexual health questions and trauma. So you've all got a good sense of what the risks are. The one important principle is about being honest about those with the potential participants, and you actually need to write about them in the consent form. So I don't think it's a good idea to pretend that everyone's going to be completely fine. I think it's much better to say you might not be fine, and this is what we're going to do if you're not fine. So each risk is associated with something that the researchers are actively going to do to help. And that is what people are consenting to, knowing what the risks might be and how researchers are going to manage those risks or what they're going to do. And we were scheduled to go in, but we're fine to go over time. Okay. Oh, I thought it was until 2:30. It was until 2:30.
Sorry, maybe it was until 2:30. Yeah. That's fine.
I had one until 2:30.
Yeah.
But yes, of course, if people need to go, that's okay.
Yeah.
So I think there's quite a bit of talk in the chat about psychological distress. And you need to work out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. How are you going to identify that someone's distressed, and who's going to look after that person? Who's the debriefer referral? What are the debriefing strategies? Someone in the chat mentioned triggers in a survey. The researcher is responsible for that and responsible for providing support, debriefing, referral, or whatever else to the research participants. Sometimes there can be, yeah, Peter.
I was going to say, one of the things that I do with folk is I talk to them about what they think would be helpful for them when they get distressed, when they do get distressed.
Yeah.
So they often have their own solutions.
Absolutely.
They've lived with this sort of triggering and trauma recurrence all their lives. And so they've often got very sophisticated ways of managing it. And,
yeah, sure.
And I reckon that's, and again, that empowers people to actually say, well, you're not passive in all of this.
Well, again, I mean, the advantage of running this workshop is that I know I've got a group of people who are experienced clinicians and know how to work with people who have had trauma and are triggered by things. So I actually think this group and AOD people in general are quite sensitive to how to deal with this. You just have to make it explicit about how to do it. Sometimes there's physical distress and it's worth making sure you've got protocols around, you know, access to appropriate healthcare. And the big one that we all worry about is the disclosure of information. Someone, their family member or someone else finding out about their alcohol and drug use, or the police finding out about criminal activities, or child protection finding out about child protection issues. And this applies to all research. Don't think that if you're doing a quant survey with people ticking boxes that you don't need to look after data privacy. Obviously, there are particular ways in which qualitative research, collecting quotes from people, need a different kind of approach to de-identification, but it applies to all of our research. Yeah, let's come back to the issue of answering the questions honestly at the end. I just want to talk a little bit about criminal activities. I'm just making a note to myself to come back to that, what we want to hear. So the question is, and I want you to just think about this, if you've collected some information as part of a project, let's say it's information about drug dealing, can you guarantee that the data will be stored anonymously? As it turns out, you probably can't, because it's actually really, really hard to store information anonymously. There's a bunch of reasons why it's hard. It doesn't seem hard, but it actually is hard. Firstly, you've got to retain your consent forms. Consent forms have signatures on them. So you've got identifying information. They might have email addresses as well to send people the study results. They might have email addresses because you want to talk to them again in 6 months and see whether they like the service that they received and so on. So good clinical research practice means you have to retain your consent forms, which are identifying. So then you need to work out how to not match a consent form with data that you've collected, the information about the person dealing drugs. So you need to separate them. You need to password protect the data as well as the consent forms. But from a research point of view, you usually have to have a code that matches the consent form to the data because like you want to go back and get their email address to do the follow-up interview or send them the results or whatever it is. So there's usually a register or a log that matches the consent form with the data. So each person is given a number and that matches the consent with the data. And technically, if you were audited by, I don't know, the Research Integrity Commission, if I was audited, I would have to show all of the consent forms because I have to prove that the clients consented to participate, and I have to show the match between the consent form and the data to show that the data is not made up. So there have been cases of researchers just making up data, going out and filling in surveys themselves instead of actually surveying people. So all sorts of misconduct happens. I've never heard of that happening in any research that I'm associated with. So it's actually really hard to actually be anonymous. The only way you can be anonymous is if you don't collect written consent, or they use a cross instead of their name, and there's a little bit of concern about the integrity of that. And it's not just the consent form and the data. There's also a whole lot of other processes that happen in research, like there might be a screening tool that you've used to screen someone in or out. We're doing research in the ACT at the moment around cannabis, and one of the screening tools, one of the screening questions is, have you sold cannabis? So we need to keep that, have you sold cannabis, separate from their consent form, separate from their data. So, and we're actually not linking. We've chosen from a privacy point of view not to link the screening question with the data that we're collecting from them subsequently. And then you've got all these email addresses to send people the results because you're good ethical researchers, and you need to keep that separate. So the question to ask yourself is, can a third party link a name with your data? And that's the question that I used to think about. If someone knocked on my door and said, I want to, you know, try and link a name to a piece of data, could they do it? And more often than not, the answer to that is yes, they probably could in theory. It would take a lot of work, but they could probably do it. And that means that I have an obligation to tell participants that there's a potential risk. And the way in which, and most commonly that's in relation to police and illegal behaviours in our population. So if that link can be made, if you haven't been able to completely anonymise, which is quite hard, then in the consent form you need to write that your data will be kept confidential, subject to legal requirements. They're the 4 key words that make clear that if you were subpoenaed for child protection or by police for criminal activity, that you have actually told the clients that that's in the consent form, subject to legal requirements. Now, I've not, actually I have been subpoenaed by police for once for a data record, but the person hadn't participated in the research. They thought they had, and they hadn't. So we didn't have any data. So it was not an issue. But look, I've been doing research for 30 years. The chances of a researcher being subpoenaed or having their data subpoenaed, I reckon it's minuscule. I mean, you guys might have better experience of it than me, but it's not been a really big deal. But the issue is about honesty to participants, and I think the child protection issue is really important in this context as well. So disclosure, especially of criminal activities, is a serious issue, requires thinking through exactly how you're storing your records, where you're storing them, password protecting them, can links be made, what's the relationship between the data and the consent or any other identifying information. And James says services are probably more likely to be subpoenaed than a researcher. Yes, indeed. Yes, okay, so we've got some comments. Rules with people making up an ID, there aren't any, but on the consent form, they have to have shown that it was them that signed it. I mean, some people do put crosses or put a fake name or something like that. I mean, we don't encourage that because we'd like to think that people trust the integrity of the research process. So I don't say, oh, you can put a fake name down if you want to, because that just implies that there's more risk if they have to do that than having actually explained exactly what the risk is, if that makes sense. Family violence reform, MARAM information sharing fit with research. Now, I don't know what MARAM stands for. Nigel, can someone else help out here and answer the question?
Yeah, that's the multi-agency risk and management for family violence, which has information sharing where people's information can be requested, and agencies are obligated to share information about perpetrators.
Yeah.
Under the new reform.
Well, that would include research data then. I assume, James.
I know of MARAM, but yeah, I just don't know. Nigel, I wouldn't be able to answer. At VADA, we have someone, you know, whose sort of area is the MARAM reforms, and implementation of that in AOD over the AOD services. But yeah, it's not my area, so I can't answer with any certainty.
Yes, and Stefan's right, it would be covered by subject to legal requirements. I mean, wherever you can, I mean, we go to extraordinary lengths to destroy things and remove things and delink things, and it's a constant process. But it's worth it, because I just feel like the integrity of me as a researcher obviously is really important, but I'm responsible for these data that I've collected from these people. And if that's going to cause harm in any way, shape or form, then, you know, I mean, that's a disaster for that person. Yeah, so it's really trying to think through, where am I storing it? How am I storing it? What are the links? Can anyone work it through? Okay, and the last bit, the last one is dissemination, which takes us right back to where we started. Ethical research requires feedback to participants. So really obvious thing to do is invite your participants to the seminar that you're giving, particularly now we're all in Zoom land. So we've recently done some alcohol and COVID work, general population, and we sent an invitation by Eventbrite to everyone who'd participated in the research to come along to the seminar. It was a seminar at UNSW. And I've got to say, it was weird knowing that I was actually speaking to an academic audience as well as people who were likely to have been participants to the survey that we'd done. It was New South Wales survey, but it was great. So invite participants to the seminars and any presentations that you're giving. And obviously, we all know, give a plain language summary of the results, but remember that email addresses are identifying. And so you need to think about data storage. And then there are some other forms of dissemination other than the usual report or a journal article. Offer to do briefings to clinicians, briefings to policymakers, develop guidelines or guidance documents about whatever it is that the topic is. And make sure your research products are discoverable. And not behind paywalls, which is a problem for journal articles, but not for anything else. Dissemination is really taken as a given, but it's a really important ethical commitment to the community that you engaged right at the very beginning with talking about what's the most important research idea to pursue, and think about creative and ethical ways of giving back to research participants. You can't do research without them, and this is for them and with them. And it's all about disseminating results to change practice and or to change policy, because just in case, we are not doing research for the sake of research. We're actually doing it for another reason altogether, which is to make a difference. And it's all about making a difference. These were the 9 lessons, just in case. You'll get the slides so you can check those out. And now we have a chance for comments, other issues, questions, anything else.
I have to start the conversation off because it reminded me of some research that I've done at my old work, and yeah, just some interest. I just think there are some interesting kind of ethical conundrums or unexpected encounters that you often have around ethics. And so the one I wrote down was, is it unethical to give a participant extra compensation? So I remember, for example, this was some research I was doing. I mean, I was the interviewer for this research, and I went to a service, and I was talking to people there who had, their workers had recruited them. And I spoke to one client who was really, really helpful, very, very nice, just a real sort of legend in terms of their participation. And they said, and we were doing vouchers because that was the policy. And they said, can I have an extra voucher because I'm seeing my kids on the weekend? And so I'd be interested in people's thoughts.
Thank you, James. Let's open that up. Yes, no, maybe. Should James give a participant 2 vouchers instead of 1? We'd have to do yes, no, maybe. What do people think about that situation and the ethics of it? No, says Nigel. Probably not, says Sione. I think probably not too, but I think, don't all alcohol and drug clinicians learn that you just have to be completely transparent with the rules and stick to the rules? Isn't that how? Look at Peter, he's roaring with laughter. I think I was taught that. Transparency, clarity, consistency, aren't they all the principles of good work in this area?
And I think, Catherine, you hit it on the head. I really wanted to, and I think this person absolutely deserved it. And I was really touched by the way they, what they shared with me. And I said no because it wouldn't be fair to other participants. But I felt shit for doing it. I really didn't feel ethical. Saying no didn't feel ethical, but I didn't.
Yeah. Thanks, James.
Yeah, no.
Thanks for sharing it. Nicole, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Alison, I was just wondering what you think about research like the annual NSP finger prick surveys and the way that they disseminate their results and information in a, I guess, a combined way through poster information that you can then put up at a needle and syringe program.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And we're now doing, oh God, infographics, you know, just simple visual summaries of our research findings and doing posters and so on. Yeah, no, I think the more ways in which research findings are disseminated, the better. And different modalities work really well for different people. So, yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah. And is that enough, though?
Sure. I mean, I think you need to think about in your studies what will people expect, and of course, given you've engaged the community, you can ask them at the very beginning what's going to be most useful to them at the end of this. Do they want a big long report? Probably not.
Yep.
Do they want a visual summary? Do they want to know that something's happened, which is the other part of research, of course? Do they want to know that actually policies changed or practices changed or whatever else?
Yeah. Thanks.
Also,
I've got a question about cultural issues and researching within culturally diverse communities, including Aboriginal communities. How culturally affected are the standard rules around research ethics? And are there variations depending on the cultural groups that you're dealing with?
Yeah, so there are variations, and there is a separate process for ethics approval for Aboriginal communities. And one of the requirements is having Aboriginal research leads, and the community, it's an example where community consultation is absolutely fundamental, and you won't get ethics approval if you haven't done that. Whereas I could get ethics approval for working with people who inject drugs who are non-Aboriginal without even having spoken to any of them easily from UNSW Ethics Committee. So that's an example of one area of strong difference.
Should there be a difference though? Should it be?
No, there should. Of course not. I mean, I think at the beginning I was arguing that consultation should be essential for all ethics committees.
Because in some ways, last comment, in some ways, the stigmatisation of people who inject drugs, that's like a classic example that they aren't considered as, well, their human rights aren't considered in that way.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Christine, were you going to make a comment?
I was just going to make a comment about dissemination and about how them having an understanding about how they might use the research themselves, and so that it gives agency to themselves in some instances. You talk about them knowing how you might have used it to change policy or influence policy, but I think sometimes they can use it to reflect on themselves or something that's happening in their family or community, or to advocate for change in an organisation that they've worked with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christine. And also they will interpret potentially and find some findings much more important and significant than we might from, or I might from my, white middle class privileged perspective, which is the value actually of collaborative data analysis, which I do quite a bit of, and I'm always shocked. I think this is completely fascinating finding, which of course the people who use drugs say, oh, for fuck's sake, that's just stupid. Look over here, so, oh, which I wouldn't have even seen. So if you do get the opportunity to do truly collaborative data analysis, it's fantastic. It's great. It's great. It's great fun too, learning. So Catherine's asking about the raw data from is it urines? No, it's oral fluid. Keeping or destroying the kits post-use. Do you have advice yourself, Catherine? What are you doing? Or don't you know, or haven't you done it?
Well, we're putting it in our proposal, but that's what we're sort of struggling with at the moment is once the kit's been done, we've got the result. Do we then leave it with the person? Do we destroy it? Are we required to keep it for any amount of time? Can we just take a photo of it and have that enough? Because I'm inclined to take a photo and then leave the kit with the person. They can do what they like with it. But I don't know.
Well, there's two different things, isn't there? There's sort of data confidentiality and, so Peter's comment earlier, I was just thinking about data sovereignty. I'm not sure whether you guys have caught up with the data sovereignty movement for Aboriginal people. It's something we all need to get our heads around, but this issue about who owns data, and actually it's the person who owns the data. So you don't own the research, the kit. You don't own the data from the kit. It's the person's to choose to do with what they want. Sorry, that was a bit convoluted. So data sovereignty as against research integrity, where the audit trail of the point at which it was collected, the record that gives the result, and then how that's stored. I mean, off the top of my head, I would go with a photograph and giving it back to the person. I think that's safer than storing them, because then you've got privacy issues with potential disclosure. As long as you've got good research integrity procedures around the photos matching to the participant, you know, blah, blah, blah. I think that's what I do. Does anyone else have any advice for Catherine?
A few people have said they'd like it destroyed, and that was my instinct to say, you know, the photo in terms of, I think, reassuring the ethics committee around a record, but then destroying is just my thought. But I haven't done clinical research, so that's just...
Yeah. And Sione's saying he'd want them destroyed.
I suppose part of it is my fear that, you know, if we keep their kits, then there's a potential for them to actually be subpoenaed and retested.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And I want to protect my people.
Yeah, yeah. Good instinct. Good instinct. Stefan?
Yes, thanks, Alison. Just wanted to share an experience we had some years ago when we were doing alcohol research with the Vietnamese community, and we worked closely with the community for at least a year in designing the study and setting it up. And we were going to involve interpreters. And when we submitted the ethics, we'd strong feedback from the community that they wouldn't sign consent forms, that they wanted to give verbal consent, and we had interpreters with us, and so we wrote this all up, and we were doing this in conjunction with some Melbourne Uni researchers, and it went to their ethics committee, and it took months of going back and forth until they finally agreed that verbal consent was okay. They were so fixed on written consent. So just pointing that out, it was worth standing our ground on that, because eventually they understood that the research wasn't going to happen, and the community were adamant that particularly some generations of people within that community were not going to sign anything and then share their story about their use of alcohol. So it was just an interesting experience of educating the committee around that specific community, and in the end agreed, yes, it could still be done ethically and consent would be obtained. But it was different to how they had expected.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. That's great to raise that issue. Yeah, verbal consent is now actually quite common, particularly for qualitative interviews. But the issue is you have to start the recording, record the consent, stop the recording, start a new recording, because you need to store the audio file of the consent in the same way as you store an audio, in the same way as you store a written consent form. But it's really common, and we're now offering verbal consent in almost all of our research studies. Yeah, yeah, that's good. That's good.
One thing I just thought I'd say, because it's come up a couple of times, and some other people might have more direct experience of this, but my understanding is that you can, if you were subpoenaed, there are avenues to I don't know what the term is, resist the subpoena or the subpoena challenged. And I know some family violence organisations that, I'm not sure what the word is, but that resist the subpoena as a matter of policy, unless the client not just consents, but actually wants their data shared.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you do is get legal advice.
Yeah.
In that situation.
But yeah, subpoena isn't absolute, and yeah, can be changed.
I'm mindful of the time, so we probably need to finish. I'm sorry if I went on a little bit too long, and thank you. I mean, ethics is endlessly fascinating, and good luck with your applications, and James will circulate the slides, but do feel free to get in touch if I can help, or there's particular issues that you want to canvass. So I hope it's been helpful for you all, and go research. Thanks, James.
No worries. Thanks so much, Alison. We really appreciate it. And I just think it's you know, I don't know, it's the best webinar I've been to over the COVID period. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will be putting a recording up. It'll just take me a little while to get it up, but I'll let everyone know when it's up, and I'll email everyone who attended with a copy of the slides as well. So I'll get those to you soon.
Great.
Thanks
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.